So the 5090 has just been released at £1,939. But for a non-Founders Edition, realistically not looking at that, you're looking at 2,600. And I'm not being funny, mate. I don't have that kind of money. This can put a lot of people off. Realistically, most people cannot afford that. Most people don't spend that on their whole computer. Mine was under half that. Speaking of, what if we took that and divided it by, say, 20? With just £129.99, how good of a PC can you actually buy? Well, let's find out. Scrolling through Facebook Marketplace under the search Gaming PC gives us a few results, such as this £180 gaming PC, featuring a CPU from 2012 with 0 upgradability, an actually alright graphics card, only 8GB of slow DDR3 RAM. We've been using DDR5 for a few years now, we need at least DDR4. A 1TB hard drive, not bad for extra storage, but SSDs are so cheap now and much faster. And again, not bad for the power supply, could do with a slightly higher wattage, but not too bad. How about this one, with an even worse CPU and worse graphics card, but at least it does have 16GB of RAM and an SSD, not a hard drive. But still, I would pass on this one. At first glance, this one looks a lot better, with a much more recent CPU and 16GB of DDR4. Unfortunately, it all falls apart when you look at the graphics card. With just an RX 460, that's got nowhere near the performance that we'd need for modern games. Despite these, I ploughed on through the slew of GT 730s and 4th Gen i5s, and managed to actually find something with a semblance of hope. This £170 bundle has everything I would need to build a PC except storage. Looking through the parts, it seems to be a good deal. I offered the seller £150, and here's what happened. So you join me in my car. I am about to head off and go and pick up some computer parts. I am not going to tell you exactly what they are. You know how much it's cost, and I want you to have a rough guess of what you expect these parts to be. Their reveal will be at some point later in the video. Anyway, let's go. Right, so just picked all of it up. Got the case, power supply, no, not power supply, graphics card, power supply and fans in there. And then we've got the motherboard, CPU, fan and RAM all in my backpack. And then we're going to get home and put all this together. We'll put an SSD in it and see if it works. It should do. So this PC is now fully built. Should all be wired up correctly. I've just turned the power supply on, and there is a light there and another light over there, which is giving me good signs. But if all goes right, that monitor should turn on. Now, let's just see. Moment of truth. Oh. Come on. Come on. Yes. No media present. Look at that. There we go. So this little message right here, I don't know how many of you know what that means. I didn't when that popped up, as you could probably tell by my tone of voice in that. That resulted in 3 days worth of troubleshooting and trying different hard drives and storage devices to get that to work. I actually had to use a completely different SSD to get that to work. The one that I had didn't work at all, even after changing the format and formatting it, cleaning it, changing everything about it. It just didn't work. But I got it sorted after about 2 days. Right, now this PC is all fully built, all set up, Windows installed, and some stuff's tested. The full bundle that came with included the Z390 motherboard, it's got an i3 9100F, 16GB of DDR4, and it had a GTX 1660 along with the VS450 power supply. But what I've done, as it cost me £150, so I have swapped out the 1660, which is worth £56 if I was to sell it to CEX currently, and I've swapped that out for a RX 570 8GB. Now, I got this in a deal with my brother's Switch, so I paid just £30 for that card, and I've also put in a hard drive which cost me £6. It's just a 500GB hard drive. It was £6, and that brings the total price of this build to either £129 or £130. So it's either about 90 pence below budget or about 10 pence over budget, if I've worked that out correctly. But this is the £130 gaming PC, and honestly, I don't think you can get much better than that. You've got a 9th gen processor and a Z390 motherboard. That's great for upgradability. 8GB graphics card. Yeah, I know it's not really. It's a bit slow and it doesn't perform as well as a new 8GB card. But obviously it won't, and it'll be completely fine for any sort of esports game. And a lot of indie games as well, and it can probably play some relatively new AAA games. Anyway, let's get into the benchmarks. Starting off with BeamNG Drive, at 1080p normal settings, it sits around 80 to 85 FPS, with occasional stutters when there's a lot in frame or during particularly bad crashes. Overall, runs very well, no real complaints from me. However, turning on traffic does affect it a little bit more, with the average dropping to around 65 to 70 FPS, which is still entirely playable. Good job, little 4-core i3. Going into PlayerUnknown's Battlegrounds at 1080p medium, we see it stay around 120 FPS when not much is happening, and drop down into the mid-80s during fights. The lack of noticeable stutters makes this a rather enjoyable experience. Well, when you can actually enjoy the game. In Cities Skylines 2, it's much the same story. At 1080p high, we see around 75 average FPS. However, this is very early game, and I have no doubts it would be much lower later down the line, so do bear that in mind. Counter-Strike 2 shows an average of about 110 FPS at 1080p high, without much range, resulting in a completely playable experience. Minecraft takes a while to stabilise before settling well into the 200s. This is at 1080p and default settings and render distance. There are of course some stutters when loading new chunks occasionally, but that is to be expected. Finally, going into Project Zomboid, we see FPS averages in the high 80s. This does dip in more demanding circumstances, but I haven't found it to become an issue. So, can you build a gaming PC for just 5% of the cost of a new 5090? Of course you can. One that can play most modern games at 1080p medium to high settings, and will run a VR headset with no issues. So if you don't want to spend over £2,500 on a new graphics card, consider something like this, with great upgradability and much better value. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.